Greetings, Com 705. This is Ben Fraser. Wanted to just spend a moment with you, just introducing the work for this week and to just touch bases with you and say I'm fairly pleased with the progress that we're making in this class. Do you realize we're almost through Little John and Foss? Our major text. We're on chapter 9 and 10 this week. Next week we have 11. The week after that we have Berger and Luckman, and then on to the Gregg and Miller text. So we're really moving rapidly through this class. We're about a third of the way through. And one of the things I want to talk to you is to make sure that you really spend some time on chapter 10. I see that as very important, particularly those of you that are very interested in media and media influence and technology, which is a good number of you because this is such a big part of what communication is today and how it's influencing. Many of the faculty here are very involved in researching and studying not only the technology itself and its influence on our communication, but then how the technology's influence influences our communication with one another. And so we have Baudrillard, who many of you maybe haven't studied before, but I really recommend you look at it. Particularly, I like his book, Simulacra and Simulation. And in that book, he talks about not only how the media is similar to us, but in the simulation, how it simulates, how it explains things. But also he talks about simulacra, which is defined as a copy without an original. And you go, well, wait, what is that? Well, what that is a place like Fantasyland at Disneyland. There's no place like that. It is a made-up place, and yet a lot of people and a lot of images are copies of that. And so we see Star Trek would be another, and you have these Star Trek conventions and that kind of thing. So where you have there's really no Star Trek anywhere. It's a made up thing that for television or for the movies. But then we see people dressing up like him, people like them, like the characters. We see that copy of without a real original thing. And that brings a different kind of sense of how we interact and how we understand and how we come to know. And any rate, so Baudrillard is one of my favorite characters. He does a lot of media influence and media effects research. Of course, we have the media effects itself, with starting with Marshall McLuhan and how the medium is the message and the importance of the medium itself in influencing how we come to understand and how we come to know and how we communicate with one another. Also in there is Walter Ong, who talks about the difference between coming from an oral culture to a written culture. And you know, when I really began to appreciate Ong is when I started to go to Tanzania and work among the Maasai, which is primarily an oral culture. Most of them, at least then, did not read and write, then meaning 15 years ago. They're beginning to now, the children are. But how when I went back to read the Old Testament, I began to see how much of the Old Testament was shaped, the writing was shaped by the fact that behind the writing of the Old Testament was that it was orally kept and preserved from generation to generation. So there's that oral influence that you can see particularly within the Old Testament. So at any rate, Walter Ong has much to say. I'm sure you've heard and read some of his things before in Dr. Keeler's class. And of course, he has a big influence in the theory making within our field. Then you move on to things like cultivation theory with Gerbner, which is a very famous theory, a theory that many people are using and trying to use. Many people challenge it, so it's controversial. But how the media itself cultivates its own interest and appetite, and how it cultivates how people think and how people feel about the world. Okay, so agenda setting. Agenda setting is an interesting one because agenda setting, I was studying that when I was doing my PhD 30 years ago. And it's still around today. It's still being used, a very popular theory, but the theory has morphed and has changed. And you really need to be able, when you talk about that theory, you need to be able to follow the changes that have happened throughout the last 30, 40 years of agenda setting research. Because agenda setting, when I was studying it 30 years ago, is very different than how we perceive agenda setting today. So there's some major changes in that. Which, that leads to an important part. When you do study theory, you need to understand that theory is like a stream or a river that continues to change and continues to develop. There are very few theories that just remain the same. And if they do, they kind of wonder, what kind of heuristic value do they have? And are they a good theory that really helps explain? Because a theory eventually tries to explain more and more communicative behavior of communication theories. So we have we have the critical school in there, and you have some interesting studies from that. So there's a number of great studies and theories that you can choose from to write about this week. And so I really encourage you to spend some time in Littlejohn, choose wisely, and have some fun writing with that. The organizational stuff is good. It's not my favorite, but I have studied some in there, and some of you I know are interested in organizational communication, and there's some great stuff in there, and I encourage you to look at that. All right. Just to give you a heads up, 2 weeks from now, we got the Berger and Luckman, so you need to begin to be reading that. Berger and Luckman is an old book, granted, but it's a benchmark study in our field. And it really represents, in my opinion, represents well the social construction of reality. And it gets us into that whole debate and that whole discussion. And so many people have taken that and moved it on. It's not that so many people are saying, oh, Berger and Luckman are... that book, the way they explain the social construction of reality, is still being done today. It has moved on from that, but that is the benchmark study. And so it serves, I think, still serves a very useful purpose for us to read and to study. By the way, Berger, it was a Lutheran. And a lot of people think, wow, these guys aren't Christian at all. They're talking about, how reality is constructed and made up from language, and that can't be real, but from a Christian perspective. But in fact, it can be, I think, and it can be useful. Now, there's some limits to it. I don't buy the whole thing, but I do think much of it is very, very useful for us to understand and know and perhaps even use. So the next few weeks should be exciting and fun. I hope you're doing well. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.